This is Jamie Dyer welcoming you to another edition of the Quo-Cast. And I'm joined once again by musician and writer Greg Harper, who's the author of Status Quo in the 1980s, which is rather apt because we're talking about the studio album Perfect Remedy today, which is 35 years old this December. Me too, Perfect Remedy. But has Perfect Remedy aged well? Has it got better with age, or is it still just part of a bad period of the Quo? So, Greg, what are your thoughts overall on this album?
Thanks for having me on again, by the way. This is really nice. I think this is our fifth one together.
I think so, yeah.
Which I feel like deserves some kind of award or something, some presentation to, your most common guest, maybe. Perfect Remedy is probably among my favourite albums, which, I shouldn't say in public. It is a band desperately trying to stay relevant and desperately trying for a hit record. And there's a lot of distractions in the recording of this album. And as a result, what we end up with is a bit of a hodgepodge of really good, strong quality commercial material and some questionable material. But it's all done quite well. It's well produced. Some people would say it's badly produced for Quo, but from a commercial perspective, the production's pretty good. Pip Williams is no slouch. He knows what he's doing, and this is very much a Pip album. This is about as close to the core of the decision making as Pip ever got, and he's very much at the helm here. I personally like the album. And I know you do too. It's considered Quo light by a lot of the hardcore fans, and I can see why. I can totally see why this alienated people, and I can totally see why it wasn't a massive hit either. I think this was coming off the back of a lot of strange decisions being made by management and by the band themselves. Ultimately, this is an album by a band in freefall, I would say.
Yeah. I, as you say, like this album. I was listening to it earlier today, and it did strike me that if they just changed some of the tracks around a tiny bit, maybe written a couple of others in a similar vein to the really strong points on this album, then it might have done better. The choice of singles were perhaps a little bit lacking in this particular quarter. This is recorded in the Bahamas, isn't it? During the summer of '89, which I can imagine would have been very distracting, because as much as like you're on an island, essentially, there's still a lot of distractions around.
Absolutely, it was by all accounts, it was paradise. Well, where they were was paradise. When they were initially shown to their billets, if you like, they weren't that knocked out with them. When they eventually found somewhere nicer to stay, they were surrounded by sunshine and beautiful pools and lots of distractions in the way of alcohol and cocaine as well. And you don't really hear that in the music as such, like you do on something like Blue for You, where everything's super fast. But you do hear it in a kind of lackadaisical approach to the writing, perhaps. A lot of the writing got done before they went out there, but also the band treated it as a bit of a holiday. So everyone took, I think with the exception of Francis, I think everyone took their wives / girlfriends. I don't think any kids went, but it was essentially just a holiday that was written off as a tax expense, and they just happened to get an album out of it. So, yeah, the surroundings would have been beautiful, and the studio itself, when it was built, was state of the art. So it was Compass Point, I think they recorded this at, and everyone had recorded there. Iron Maiden had cut a couple of albums there, 3 albums maybe. By this point, though, it was up for sale, I believe. I believe that the studio had kind of fallen into bad financial situations, and the island itself was losing tourist trade for one reason or another. And Quo were among the kind of last customers, last clients, if you like, of this studio. So, some people have said the gear wasn't in particularly good condition. It was clearly good enough for David Bowie, because Tin Machine, are you familiar with Tin Machine, Bowie's? They were out there at the same time, which freaked Rhino out, apparently, because he's a massive Bowie fan. Probably more than anyone else in the band was. So he got very starstruck and tongue-tied, and I believe he offered Quo a song that they turned down. The Tin Machine album did relatively well, and Quo's Perfect Remedy kind of flopped. I mean, don't get me wrong, those kind of I'd kill for those kind of sales, especially in today's musical climate. But for Quo, those were really low sales.
Well, especially as they were still kind of in the mainstream. They appeared on Steve Wright's program, rest in peace. They were on TV shows doing bits and pieces, so they were still very much in that kind of primetime mainstream thing. So for something like this, to flop, something went wrong somewhere. I've got the album here on CD. I also own the vinyl copy, which I purchased recently. This cover, I was always kind of disappointed by the cover of Perfect Remedy, because I think if they'd done Anniversary Waltz as an album, almost like Famous in the Last Century, but where the whole album just keeps going in that medley style, I think this, with the jukebox, would have been perfect, with the band inside it, perhaps.
I've always had a soft spot for that video.
That would have been a really interesting thing, but with there, it kind of seems almost pointless, because a jukebox is kind of it's a retro item, and it's like, well, what's it saying about the band? Is it saying, well, this is a retro band, but they're trying to do quite a contemporary sound? And like, when I see a jukebox, I think cover versions and stuff like that, or greatest hits, let's say. So perhaps not the greatest. I think as well, with the twin guitars, that's not the first time that they've used that image, is it? That was used a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the guitars certainly, I don't think were Andy Bound's idea, because allegedly Andy Bound sketched out these ideas, and he sketched out 4 or 5 ideas for covers. None of them were the jukebox at first, funnily enough. And they were presented to management. Management asked him to come up with ideas for what he considered to be a perfect remedy, as that was already going to be the title of the album. So he'd drawn things like medicine bottles and like an alcoholic drink or whatever, the kind of things that people would use as a throwaway reference to a perfect remedy. And they didn't like any of them. So as a kind of last resort, he said, well, what about a jukebox? Because Andy's a big fan of those old rock and roll records, as most of the band are, to be fair. And management went, yeah, that's it. And we'll put a couple of guitars on the front. And that became the Perfect Remedy album, which I think it's a lovely drawing. It's beautifully done. I forget the artist's name. Really bad, I know. It was in the book. Go buy the book, folks. The drawing itself, the painting, the drawing is beautiful, but I agree that it doesn't really represent the material at all. And I would also agree with the point you just made about moving the track listing around. There's so many tracks on there that are well done, but should have been B-sides, and vice versa. There was plenty of B-sides that definitely should have been album tracks. So things like Address Book, which I'm sure we're going to come on to, should have been a B-side, really. It's a good track if you're into that kind of thing, but perhaps not an album track. I don't know.
No. So let's get on a track-by-track analysis. Track one is Little Dreamer, which was the second single released from this album. Great video, very MTV. Um, Very big sound to this one. Very big sound.
Yeah, I think this is one of those tunes that evolved from Francis noodling around on live gigs at the beginning of Down Down, similar to how Backbone or Backing Off, no Backbone, sorry, was conceived. And it's a very Quo-y riff. Lots of synths, lots of synth bass on there as well. They really are in that kind of more is more mode on this track. Really throwing the kitchen sink at it from a production perspective. Super catchy. Allegedly comes from Bernie Frost's son. That da 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 da, pretty little dreamer. That line at the beginning was originally Bernie Frost's son wandering around while Bernie and Francis were writing, going, "I need a day off, I need a bleeding day off," and they kind of latched onto that as a melodic figure that they could build the song around. The video is good; it's well shot, and it's quite amusing in places. You probably wouldn't get away with it now. It's a little on the creepy side now, but visually, aesthetically, it's well filmed and. It kind of did bring Quo into the modern day with regards to storytelling through video. They'd kind of started that with Who Gets the Love, taking the videos a little more seriously than they had. They had In the Army Now, which was a pretty good video, but these are very much, like you say, MTV style videos. They're pretty well conceived, actually.
And this one in particular, it showed them as a rock band, and compared to what they did as the first single, this should have been the first single, to be honest, because it's the opener to the album. It's got a big sound to it, as I say. It's very catchy. There are solo elements to it. There are sort of bits that people can catch on to. And it's also that thing, I can't remember who it was, but I feel like when 1982 came out and they released She Don't Fool Me, I think it might have been someone like Pete Townsend. I can't remember. But I think they heard She Don't Fool Me and they said it sounded like Quo were going to do something interesting. And then they just did the same old thing that we've heard before. And I think in some ways Little Dreamer is kind of that, because you hear that intro and you think, oh, something interesting is happening. And then it's just da 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 before it goes off into obviously different sections. But when I was listening to it, that's kind of what jumped into my mind, that maybe as much as I think it would have been a great first single that would have launched this album perhaps better, maybe those outside of the camp might have said, yeah, but it's kind of same old Quo type thing.
I think you're right. I think there's definitely a lot of pressure on Pip and Francis to deliver a hit record by this point. And they know that they've essentially got a foot in both camps here. They're writing super commercial poppy stuff that Francis really loves. And they also want to maintain some of this rock aesthetic that pleases the fan base. And I think their days for doing that successfully were effectively over. The fans wanted it harder and darker, and commercially, the public wanted it lighter and fluffier. And it's hard to bridge that gap now. What the public originally liked in pop music had shifted so far that to try and straddle that, they're almost doing the splits. Those things are so far apart. There's a chasm of a difference. And I think that's what this album and a lot of their late 80s output suffers from, is that they're trying to please everybody. I think perhaps if they'd have gone with one or the other, if they'd have gone down the kind of AC/DC, Def Leppard route of making, a rock album, they'd have had a hit with that. And if they'd have gone down the avenue that I'm sure Francis would have liked of making a country album, a sort of light country album for your average punter, your housewife, or your yuppie working in the city, they'd have had a hit with that. But instead, they were trying to do both, I think, and I think that's what bit them on the backside.
Well, that does, when you listen to it, that does strike you because there's a number of different styles in here and different approaches. And like you say, if they just picked one, they might have had success in various different ways. We'll go on to the first single released, Not At All. And it's worth noting that both of these singles, they basically went down the toilet a little bit, just outside the top 40, I think.
Yeah, I like Not At All, though. I think it's a good track. Poor single choice, which I believe was a Francis choice. I think he really fought for that as a single, because I think he felt that it had that kind of bluesy element, that kind of, it was a shuffle, it had a dum 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 dum. So aesthetically it was kind of Quo, but the melody and the production are still so based around music that is totally inoffensive. That the music's just a vehicle for Francis's melody and lyric. That's something that I think, again, bit him on the backside, because Francis knows what he likes, and he's got a great ear for a melody, writes good lyrics, great producer. He's shown us evidence of all those things time and time again. But again, this is this desperation for a hit record and trying to please the fan base. I think it was a poor choice of single. I think it would have been a good album track.
I think
which
so.
It was.
Because I think they played it on Jukebox Jury, and they basically went, it's kind of just same old Quo, and it's kind of boring.
They panned it.
It just kind of plods along. And after I saw that, I pretty much thought after that, well, they're right. I'm a big fan, but it does sort of plod along. It's a fun video that shows Francis drumming. It's a fun concept.
That's rare. That's rare to see Francis Rossi behind a drum kit, even though he's quite an adept drummer, allegedly. The thing is with the video, again, it's Quo not taking it themselves seriously. And I think on the one hand, that's always endeared people to them, or endeared them to people, whichever the right term is. I think that broadened the fan base, but isolated them from the fans themselves, because, it was things like, going on things like Tiswas or the Michael Barrymore Show or Cannon and Ball, all of these things kind of, I think the hardcore fans kind of saw this as a further piss-taking. They'd kind of lived through Quo being annihilated by the press. And now that the press were kind of into Quo, as long as they were, cheeky chappies behaving relatively nicely, getting a laugh on talk shows and stuff. And I think the video for Not At All is indicative of that, in that, it's Quo again, not taking themselves too seriously. And that was a marketing strategy for a long time. And again, I think when people talk about them losing fans, I don't think it's always necessarily because of the records they were making, but the way they were allowing themselves to be perceived in the press and in the media. And that video is indicative of that, I think.
I think so. Now you say that does make sense. Let's go on to track 3, which is a Bowen Palmer composition, Heart on Hold. This is almost like a leftover from Ain't Complaining a little bit, because it's along those sort of lines, isn't it? It's like just straightforward, almost like rock 80s pop type thing.
Yeah, allegedly. I mean, it is a leftover, but it's actually a leftover from a lot earlier. It's a late 70s demo when he... Well, actually, no, that's a lie. It was an early 80s demo, because that's when he was knocking about with Phil Palmer, like you say. And they recorded that as a demo, I believe, around the back-to-back period. I might be wrong there. And they gave it to their publisher and they couldn't get rid of it. The publisher was touting it around all these different artists that they thought it would be right for. And it was only when Quo got back together that it came back on Andy's radar as a potential for Quo. it's an interesting track. You can always rely on Andrew Bound to give you an interesting track. Whether you like it or not is a different matter, but he's always trying to think outside the box, always trying to do something different. And he's a big lyrics man as well. Not only is he great with chords and harmony, but he's a really fine lyricist as well. And Heart on Hold is an element of that. The metaphor gets a bit laboured after a while. It's, you know, it goes on a little too long, verse-wise, lyrics-wise. There's a great guitar solo on it. Some of the production aesthetics are interesting. The sound effects are a bit naff. Those haven't aged particularly well. To be honest, I'm not even sure they were that cool then. But again, this is Andrew Bound trying to do something that no one else in the band is doing. And that's giving them an art record. You know, when you think of the things that Andy's given to the band over the years, they've either been super commercial, like Whatever You Want, or they've been totally off the wall, pretty wacky, arty pieces like Another Shipwreck, which I know we need to stop talking about. And I think Heart on Hold is an example of that, of Andy Bound trying to push the band and challenge them a little. And Francis's guitar solo on that is great. I think I mentioned in the book, you can hear the sound of the room on that guitar solo. You can hear the natural reverb in that stone room where the amp was isolated. It sounds great.
Yeah, like you say, the computer stuff within it gets a little bit laboured after a while, but actually was quite forward thinking for the mid '80s. It's a little bit like Tron. It's like audiences didn't understand it then, but as it got even more relevant as time went on.
Absolutely. You know, it could have, you could have rocked it up further if you wanted to. You know, it could have become quite a Dire Straitsy type, hence the Phil Palmer connection, I suppose. But it could have been a very kind of Dire Straitsy type arrangement. But alas, it ended up like it did. It's, again, a good album track, I think. I think it's better than a B-side, and it deserves its rightful place on the album, again, which it did end up with.
I do like Rick Parfitt's harmony on the chorus there. To me, that kind of lifts it a bit, because it's kind of this, again, sort of slow to mid-tempo, almost ploddy number that's doing a lot of sound effects and a lot of things, and then just to hear that extra vocal in the chorus.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so unusual. You don't really get that on Quo records, where they're singing a counterpoint, where the backing vocal takes over a little bit of tune underneath. That sounds really cool, and it's mixed really high, which is really nice to hear.
Along with those robot voices, but we won't talk about those.
No,
we won't talk
on.
about those. Yeah, let's move on. Let's not have a freeze frame on this one. Let's move on
good.
to Perfect Remedy, the title track of this album.
I love that title track. I originally came across that before I had that album on. I'm pretty sure that was on. There was like a 3 CD box set called The Essential Quo, and it had like volume 1, 2, and 3 in it.
Yeah,
and I'm pretty sure it was on that. And I remember hearing that and loving that.
I think it's on volume 1. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just, because the feel is great. No one talks about Quo's feel enough. And this is the ultimate thing. Yeah, the guitar solos are pretty good. The lyrics are pretty good. The melodies are catchy. That's all well and good, but Quo can really groove. And it's on full display there. To the point, like, Jeff Rich and Rhino are working such a great rhythm section on that track. And it's quite a fast shuffle. But it grooves so beautifully. And that track, kind of from the off, as soon as the band roll in on that first verse, oh man, it feels great. And then there's that little guitar solo on the end. Again, like quite Irish, really type stuff. Lots of major scale, which Francis loves. He leans into that stuff quite a lot on that track, and it works for it. Perfect Remedy's a great track, and I think they played it live.
They did, yeah. I was about to say that, yeah.
I've heard a bit of the live recordings, and it sounds great live as well. Really motors on. Yeah, it's one of the best tracks. It's one of the best cuts on the album.
I think their choice of live material at this point from this album, I think, shows the tracks that maybe that stood out. I mean, they did Little Dreamer, they did Perfect Remedy, and they did another one which we shall talk about. All three of those, you could put those in a Quo set, and they just, they fit alongside everything else quite nicely.
Yeah, they're a part of the kind of oeuvre of Status Quo. The typical good quality stuff from that period. It stands up with. You put it this way: you could make a killing album with bits of In the Army, bits of Ain't Complaining, and bits of Perfect Remedy. You could make a classic Quo album from those albums if you condensed them down to about 10 tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that means you'd lose, the odd things like One for the Money and the Dress Book and whatever, but I think Quo would have preferred to have had, a classic album from that period. Like a Hello or a Blue for You or On the Level. It could have been their second renaissance.
And the thing is, with some of the tracks that we've mentioned, they are on the cusp of that. They're almost trying to attempt that with some of these things. And if they'd been marketed differently, and like I said, if they'd maybe added a couple of tracks, maybe changed the production a little bit, this album in particular, we could have been talking about it as one of the classics. But sadly,
it still would have upset people. People would have still gone, "It's not real Quo because that bass player's not got a head on his bass and the drummer's got big curly hair." Do you know what I mean? There'd have been some excuse for why the original fans wouldn't have liked it, but I think it would have aged a lot better. And I think it's something that people would have rediscovered later on, and kind of it's like when people talk about the White Album or Magical Mystery Tour. At the time, people were like, huh? But they've since become classics, and I think that could have, maybe not in the same esteem as those albums, but we could be talking about it as one of the Quo classic albums rather than this flop that had some diamonds in the dirt.
Yeah, let's talk about a fan favourite now, and I say that firmly, tongue in cheek. In fact, I've got my guitar here. Maybe we should have a little sing-song and sing it, because I think the fans would like that. Or maybe I should leave that to Richard Digance to do that. We're talking about Address Book, which is possibly, we have to remember that the Quo songbook, and that's encompassing all writers, all recordings, they have songs like Claudie, they have songs like Fine, 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 they have songs like Someone Show Me Home, and Address Book is, and I know when I say this, people are going to say it's not like those, like it's in the vein of those. If you put those kind of alongside, you'd say those are all country style records. Some of the earlier ones have more of a rocky feel to them, but there is kind of that country strum along, acoustic thing, as has been evidenced in some of the later work. What do you think of Address Book?
It's not a favourite. I'd be lying if I said it was one of my favourites. It's again, I'm almost convinced that Francis just loves melodies, and it is a pretty melody, and it's a pretty little chord sequence, and it all kind of fits together quite nice. I think if the lyrics, I know Francis takes his lyric writing very seriously, as he should, and he's a good lyricist when he puts his mind to it. That track, I feel, is a missed opportunity for a real meaningful lyric. But it's almost like the lyrics are a placeholder just while they suss the melody out, which is great, but then they never go back and rework on the lyrics and get them up to scratch. So yeah, it's very twee, it's very safe, it's very soft. The playing's good on it, the guitar playing's fab. The production's all right if you're into that. It's kind of, have you come across a band called Alabama? They were like a country band. Didn't have any hits over here really, but quite big out in America.
A little bit, yeah.
It's kind of got that vibe about it. It's good. I think the lyrics let it down. Rather than going for these deep, meaningful lyrics that Quo can do quite well, they've gone for this kind of again, yuppie love thing. This idea of throwing away an old address book. It's just a bit naff. I think with better lyrics, I think it would be held in much higher esteem.
I think the arrangement is slightly flawed on this because they've kind of tried to fit it within the Quo perimeters. And when you look at the version they did on TV with Richard Digance, that with the orchestral arrangement and stuff just fills it in, and I think just works slightly better than using the guitar for those melody lines. And I think I do wonder sometimes how they came about to do that in the first place. Like, did Digance look over the list of tracks that they had, and said, "Oh, I'd like to do that"? Richard, call me. Would love to have you on the podcast to talk about your experience of playing.
You know what? I bet he'd do that.
Yeah, I hope so.
Apparently, I've never met him myself, but I know a lot of people who have, and apparently he's an absolute sweetheart. Apparently he's a really nice bloke, really down to earth, cheeky chappy, a bit like Francis in that respect, but a great guitar picker. Man, no one talks about Richard Digance's guitar picking. That guy, like, his Travis picking is mint. So it was quite a boon for Quo to play with him in a way, because all right, he's a folky, so the voice isn't to everyone's taste, but his guitar picking, man, is quality. I'm kind of also interested, like, who did that string arrangement? Is that string arrangement even live? It makes sense for it to be. And, union rules at the time probably insisted that was a live orchestra. So who did that string arrangement? Where did that come from? It must have been... Was it an ITV thing, that?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know whether they had a staff arranger or anything at ITV at the time. I know the Beeb did, but I'd be quite interested. Pip Williams will know.
I mean, it'd be funny if it was Pip that did it.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, because he's very good at that. He does the string arrangements for Nightwish and stuff, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. And he's great. He wrote the horn arrangements for things like Let Me Fly and some of the Rockin' All Over the World stuff as well. So,
I mean, personally,
that wouldn't surprise me.
I prefer that version to the one on the album. It kind of just feels like they should have gone on a slightly different road with the production and the arrangement of that. But that's just my opinion. Let's go on to The Power of Rock, or as some people call it, The Power of Rock and Roll, because of the chorus. This is a long song, really. It was also the B-side to Anniversary Waltz, and it was going to be a single, I believe. They cut a single version, and then the idea for Anniversary Waltz came up, and it was basically scrapped. But because of the success of Anniversary Waltz, we can say that The Power of Rock is technically like a top 5 Quo record, because it's on the B side. But we're getting into tenuous links now, aren't we? I guess. But The Power of Rock, I mean, what a track! Possibly the best track on this album
by a considerable margin, actually. The chorus is anthemic, great story. It's a Pip Williams thing, and if you think, if Pip hadn't have suggested that song and brought that song forward, what would be on the album that people liked? That's the kind of only saving grace for a lot of people, that track. The production's great. It sounds big. It's still kind of light, as opposed to, a 4,500 times or... Yeah, it's a great track. Great vocal from Francis and a great vocal from Rick as well. I love tracks where they're both featured vocalists. I've always liked that. Where one sings the bridge. They do it on Something About You Baby and The Wanderer and all that kind of stuff. I just love stuff like that. Great piano solo, great piano break from Andy Bown. Rhino plays his arse off on that tune as well. And Jeff Rich, actually.
Yeah. There's
like some of that... it could be... It's not a double bass drum, but it could be, that half-time thing in the verses, and it just sounds cool. And it is one of them tracks where if you think you don't like it, put it through a good hi-fi and crank it, and you'll like it. I'm almost certain of it, because the production and the delivery, particularly of the vocal, is superb.
Now, I thought this the other day when I was thinking about this episode and preparing. And I remember that story that gets told that around sort of the mid 80s, they were thinking of recording John Farnham's You're the Voice. And this is almost vocally probably the closest to that type of thing because of that, all that sort of stuff. Almost reminded me of that type of thing.
I never made that connection, actually, but that's a really good point. The You're the Voice would have been for Ain't Complaining, but Pip and Francis loved the track. So it's highly likely that Pip's gone away and thought, all right, well, if we can't do that, let's do something close, because those big anthemic choruses are what's selling, and they were selling. I'd like to think that if they'd have released The Power Rock as a single, it would have hit. I would like to think that. It probably wouldn't. Quo was so out of fashion at the time. But then, like you say, they have something like the Anniversary Waltz off the back of Jive Bunny, and away we go again. The second Quo Renaissance comes round a little later than we would have liked, but it does happen eventually.
So let's move on to track number 7, The Way I Am, which sounds like Quo but doesn't. That solo at the beginning, I'm sure it blew out a few speakers back in the day.
Yeah, I love it. Again, it's one of the stronger album tracks. I think Rhino had a lot to do with that. I've got a funny feeling Mike Paxman's got a credit on that as well, doesn't he?
Possibly.
It's a good track. And again, Francis is very encouraging of getting a writing credit from as many members of the band as possible on these albums by this point.
You're right. Mike does have a credit along with Jeff Rich. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So they all come from the Judy Zook camp. They all worked with Judy Zook around the same time, and their work, I mean, that's stunning work with Judy Zook, the three of them. But they'll have been trying to get a hit with Quo, and Rhino's probably got his mates in on the act, like Mike Paxman. Okay, let's write a track for Quo, and they'll have had publishing deals and things like that. And like I say, Francis was quite keen at the time to make the band appear like a band, because of everything that had gone on in the press with Alan Lancaster and John Coughlin and The End of the Road and all that. The easiest way to make this look like a band effort was to get a writing credit from everybody, which he later said led to, some weird quality control issues with certain material. But it's one of the rockier tracks on the album. There's some good lead guitar work on there, I think, from Pip. I'm almost certain that that twin harmony at the end is done with a digital harmonizer rather than, double tracked up with harmonies, because it's so accurate and so clean, and it rides right across the chords. It doesn't always pick the right harmony for the chords, so it makes me wonder whether that was quite an early harmonizer unit, rack mounted harmonizer they were using at Compass Point. Again, nice shuffle, head bobber. I think that's one of the problems with this album, is that everything is so medium paced. Everything is around that tempo, with the exception of Power of Rock. Everything is around that tempo. So everything's got this kind of head bobby. There's nothing really motoring on. But yeah, I like it. It's good.
Me too. I love the solos in this are brilliant. I love the way it kind of I actually like the ploddy nature. I couldn't imagine that being any faster. And
no, not that track, but I think when you have an album, I think getting a mix of tempos and a mix of feels, is quite important, because that's how you get a journey. And Quo have been criticised for decades now for every song sounding the same. And when you make an album like Perfect Remedy, you kind of got to see why, because all the tracks are very similar in nature. Mm-hmm. Certainly tempo-wise.
Yeah, I think so. I like the lyrics to this one as well. They're quite catchy. Let's go on, but not skip. But I'm sure many fans have done. I'm sure there's like a giant scratch mark where people have tried to skip it on their record players. People have been rapping on this song for, 35 years. And what I can say to that is, let it go, let it go, let it go, let it go, let it go. All right? Right. There we are. Little reference to the lyrics there. I know they're different. It's a pun. Tommy's in love.
Again, this is a typical example of Francis loving this melody to the point where he'd have been quite happy to sit there and la it, without any lyrics. He just loves that kind of country-ish melody, lots of major scale, lots of all the pretty intervals, nice chord sequence, and, thinks, I've got to write some lyrics for it because I want to put it on the record. And it turns into something like Tommy's in Love, which is pretty pants. It's not great. It's definitely maybe B-side material. It's certainly not worthy of being an album track, which is bizarre because they redid it later. He must just... I think he doubles down on stuff, Francis. I don't know. I don't claim to know him particularly well, but he strikes me as the kind of bloke to go, well, sod it, I'm doing it, just to make a point. And I think that might be why they re-recorded it. But yeah, if I'm going to skip anything on the album, it's probably that. Not because I think it's awful or dreadful or because it's not Quo, but because it's so inoffensive that it's completely unchallenging. It's like, I'm not offended by the song Twinkle Twinkle Little Star either, but I wouldn't choose to put it on a long drive, I'm not offended by it. It doesn't upset me, but I think Quo are capable of so much more than that. And, maybe with different lyrics, that would have been tolerable. I'm not a lyrics man, really. I'm not someone who's obsessive about lyrics or anything like that. I'm a bit like Francis in the respect that I always value a tune and a great chord sequence over a lyric. But if you're looking for a hit record, you've got to write better lyrics than that, unfortunately.
I mean, I like the way he rhymes tries with alibis, like that. I've always liked that, and the way that he pronounces that. This is one of those songs, again, that on a different project with a different arrangement would be passable. I like the synthesizers on this. I like the way that kind of gives it its laid-back feel. Like you say, they did re-record it on the Rock Till You Drop album, which was literally like the next original one on. And someone actually asked Jeff Rich at the convention a couple of years ago, why did you record that twice? And I believe his answer was, not a Scooby, mate. Because, which... it's because the thing is, I would imagine these sessions are quite long, right? And you're bouncing around songs, and you must get through so many songs. And it might it be that they thought they'd give it a go in the Rock Till You Drop sessions. Someone along the way went, okay, let's put that on. That's okay, Maybe because of the different sound they were using, like, well, maybe that's better. I actually prefer this version to the one on Rock Till You Drop because I think all its extra accompaniments make it a slightly, it fits it better.
Which is the one with the guitar solo? Is that the Rock Till You Drop one?
Oh, goodness. Don't they both have guitar solos?
No, I think one of them doesn't, weirdly. Right. And I prefer the one with the guitar just because it's something other than that bloody refrain. You'll notice the use of that word there as well. So I think I prefer the rockier one, the one with the guitar solo, which I think is the Rock Till You Drop one. Mm-hmm. But I could be wrong there. I could have got them totally mixed up. It just goes to show how often I'll listen to them, really. I would agree with you with regards to including it on the album as a kind of, oh, well, we've got it, so let's put it on. But both the Rock Till You Drop album and the Perfect Remedy album, Quo were being really prolific with writing at that point. You only need to look at the bonus tracks for both of those albums, and they've got plenty of good material being used as B-sides. Mm-hmm. that could have taken its place. So it really does flummox me, to be honest, as to why that got included twice. You know, when you've got something like Rotten to the Bone, which I know that wasn't an album track, was it? That was a B-side.
No, that was a B-side, yeah.
You know, put that on instead of bloody Tommy's in Love. Gordon Bennett. You know, that's, you know, you'd be replacing it with a killing rock track, at least. I love Quo's country vibes. Always have and probably always will. And I love Francis as a songwriter, but that song does not do it for me, unfortunately.
Well, let's move over it then. Let's go to Man Overboard, which is another one of Rick's mid to late 80s dark songs, of which there's at least two I can think of. Overdose and this one. And I feel like there is another one in the mix somewhere that I'm forgetting about. But they're sort of, they're a little bit more on the sort of stadium rock, darker edge of things.
Yeah. I like the lyric in that one. On top of it, all my A strings
gone again. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that line. That's such a funny line. But again, it's that dum 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 dum. You know, and it's another one of them. I feel like by this point in the album, we've heard that rhythm at that tempo so much that you'd have to do the album in two sittings. I do listen to the album semi-regularly, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. That is a good track, but I think if you're listening to the album in sequence, you've kind of had enough by that point. Certainly after Tommy, you know. There's good guitar work on it. I like the chord sequence. Again, Rhino's playing a great groove on that, and he's not doing an awful lot. But he's just really locked in with Jeff. It sounds really cool. Nice shuffle. With that kind of pedal tone thing as well, is quite cool. Good lyrics, but again, it's more of the same, rhythmically anyway.
Great vocals from Rick though. Like when he's on his game with that, when somebody says, "Hey Rick, do a soaring rock vocal," he'll do it, you know.
Yeah, well, here's an unpopular opinion. Rick was singing at his best at that point. You know, Rick from, I would say, 83 to 91 is Rick's best vocals. That's not to say he didn't do well later or earlier, but from a rock voice perspective, I don't think he got any better than that. I think that was, you know, the cream of the crop, if you like.
Yeah.
Oh man, we need to stop doing this. I'm going to stop doing that now. I'm going to stop doing the silly jokes. I do think that was Rick at his best, that period.
Yeah, I would agree with you to a point. I think there's different styles of Rick singing, and certainly with that rock voice, like you say, that is probably the high point. Let's go on to Going Down for the first time. I think at this point, those last 3 tracks on the record, I'm sure there are copies out there again with giant scratch marks where they've tried to skip past it, because it kind of goes a bit sort of country at this point to the maximum. I feel like in your book, you make reference to something Rhino said, where he said that it was kind of looking for like a Beatles type thing with this song. Am I right with that? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, you bang on, yeah.
Which we know he loves the Beatles and he loves that kind of beat sound, I believe. He certainly mentions it in the books of his new album, I believe. And it kind of turned into a country song.
Yeah, I think that's a Francis thing. I think Francis saw that as an opportunity to get another country song on the album. What I will say is, it's actually the best country song on the album, and it is one of Quo's better country songs. And it's not really from the pen of Francis Rossi either, which is kind of surprising. The lyrics are fabulous. We get so used to banging our heads against the wall, it's only when we stop it starts to hurt. Man, that's a great line. That's a great lyric.
I wake up every morning, that's my first mistake. From then
Yeah,
on
exactly.
in, it's downhill all the way. Like it's like some kind of poetry. Like it's
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a good song. It's, I can see why it pissed a lot of fans off. But the chord sequence is great. The vocal delivery is great, and the backing vocals doing that those big like dips, those big falls over. Again, that's probably a Pip Williams arrangement thing, but there's more on that record going on than first appears on first listen. Anyway, if you really listen to that on a good pair of headphones, there's a lot about that arrangement you'll notice. The lyrics are great, the playing's great, the production's what you would expect. But the arrangement and the lyrics are pretty brilliant, actually. I think if I had to keep one of the country songs on the album, it would be that one.
I'm not a huge fan of the intro riff. Probably an unpopular opinion, but not a huge fan of that. Yeah, I think maybe for some people it'd be a bit too close to Margarita.
Yeah, I think it's probably a similar synth, actually. Yeah, Francis bloody loved that sound. He really loved it. Someone said there's pedal steel on it. There isn't. There's no pedal steel on that track, even though some people will tell you there is. But that intro riff played on a pedal steel would have sounded so much better. Just because that keyboard sound is just it. Not only does it date it, but it's very artificial. There might be some live fiddle on it. I'm not sure. I don't think if there was any live fiddle on it, that was done back home when they got the tapes back from Compass Point, because they hadn't been particularly productive out there. So it's possible that Graham Prescott was brought in to do a little bit of live fiddle on it. But if there is any live fiddle on there, it's almost definitely mixed right down in the mix in favour of that keyboard. Sounds like a mono synth, that kind of whip sound. But yeah, I don't mind it.
Well, let's move on to Throw Her a Line, which I don't know about you. First time I heard it, I thought this chord sequence and this line sound very familiar. And then I just happened to be listening to some Roxy music one day. Virginia Plain, Roxy Music.
Oh, is that on their second album, that?
Might be. I'm not that familiar with their discography, but it was a big song. What's her name? Virginia Plain. The chord sequence, and I realise, the chord sequences are repeated. Like there's only so many sequences, but the line "Throw Her a Line" is in Roxy Music. That song.
Yeah,
it "Throw me a line, I'm sinking fast," and so I have, that was just a similarity I noticed. I don't think I've ever seen anyone make that comparison before.
No. The only reason I know what you're talking about, a friend of mine recently tried to convert me to Roxy Music, and he gave me on CD the first two albums. And I was listening to them on the way to a gig a couple of months back. And I remember coming across that track and going, man, that sounds a bit like Throw Her a Line by Status Quo. And then it kind of popped out of my head. But yeah, you're right. I think it would be completely unintentional. It's either a happy accident or it's something that they've kind of subliminally kept and it's kind of slipped out during the writing, which happens as a composer. That happens more often than you would like to admit. There's nothing worse than playing someone something. Go, yeah, what do you think of this? And they go, oh, it sounds like da da da. And you go, oh shit, yeah, it does, doesn't it? And so it's highly possible that just slipped through the net. They're probably not even aware of any similarity. But what I will say, I do like Throw Her a Line. I think we've got some rhythmic integrity back now to the album right towards the end. The speed's up a little, and it's not that kind of ploddy tune either. It motors on quite nicely. Some nice lead guitar work on there as well, if I remember rightly. nice chord sequence, like you mentioned. It's a good album track. It's a good album track.
Yes, it's sort of under the line of filler, isn't it? Really, but I do
Yeah.
like the keyboard playing on it. I think that intro is very striking. It's got a decent solo on it as well, and it's worth saying. Although I've likened it to the Roxy Music thing, it does go off into other directions. You know,
Yeah.
it's not a carbon copy. I should make that clear. And like you say, there's a lot of repetition in songwriting. You know, there has to be in some ways. But with this one, I like the lyrics of it. I like the arrangement. I like the keyboards, and like you say, just kind of a filler album track. Let's make a dash for the end. Go on to track 12, which is the last track on this album, 1,000 Years. And there's a track on the previous album, I Know You're Leaving, which always sounded to me like REO Speedwagon, is sort of that type of thing. There's a couple of tracks on that album that sort of have that vibe. This, again, is another one of those like 80s pop kind of things mixed with sort of maybe early 60s beat music and early rock and roll sort of ballady stuff. There's a big mix of styles going on there. What do you think of 1,000 Years?
This is probably about as far away from the original archetype of the Status Quo sound Quo ever went to.
Yeah.
Having said that, harmonically, it's great. The chords are great. That intro especially, it's just full of great chords. It's like, let me think. C, I think it's in C, and there's like an A7 augmented, and then there's like an E diminished, and there's like a G augmented as well, or a G13 augmented. Like, Status Quo don't use those chords. You know, proper chords, you know, almost Tim Alley-esque country song, like ballad, rock ballad.
Yeah.
And those are really ear-grabbing chords. It's a really ear-grabbing intro. It's a lovely lyric. It's quite a sentimental lyric, but it's sweet. And it's well delivered by Francis. Does it fit on the album? I think if you'd have lost things like Tommy and Address Book, mm-hmm. you could have gotten away with it, and I think it wouldn't have upset as many people as it did. But I think it's probably badly placed as well. I probably wouldn't have put it right on the end of the album either. I don't know. Who am I to say? I don't know. But I think it's a good song. It's really well written song, and it suits Francis's voice.
Yeah,
I just think it's a bit of an anticlimax as a closer.
Well, yeah, you want something sort of more up tempo to finish it. I mean, I think if Power of Rock had perhaps been put at the end, that might have finished it on a much brighter note.
Yeah, agreed.
Certainly with regards to Little Dreamer, which is a relatively up tempo number for Quo in this point, or Perfect Remedy, perhaps. You know, like just some kind of starting high and ending high, but you know, it ends on this kind of low ebb, I guess. I like the guitar intro, that sort of acoustic-y guitar intro. Do you know if that is Pip or Francis?
I don't. If I was guessing, that's Francis. He likes those kind of open string. I don't know if I've got a guitar here actually. A Brian May guitar, no less. Yeah, so there's like a flat 13 in that run. That's probably like a Francis thing. You get over that chord.
Yeah.
That's probably a Francis thing. Pip tended to do a lot of the lead work, solos and things are more Pip. Anything that acoustic or that integral to the arrangement is probably Francis. Anything fiery is probably Pip. Anything quite lyrical and quite, I don't mean this disrespectfully, achievable to most guitarists is probably Francis. Mm-hmm. The pyrotechnics he would have left to Pip. But those chords, Pip will have known exactly what those chords were. Mm-hmm. Francis probably knew the shapes and knew what they sounded like, but probably didn't know what to call them at the time. He's since become a lot better at that, Francis. He can talk about chords and harmony a lot clearer now, certainly on his Tunes and Chat tour and stuff. He takes music a lot more seriously than perhaps he used to from a theoretical point of view. It's highly likely that Pip would have gone, I like them chords, I'll play more of that, It's a good song. I don't know whether it should close the album. I don't even know whether, it fits the Quo aesthetic. But if you're being unbiased about it and you're just looking at it as a composition, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's a really good record.
No, like you say. Yeah, I agree. So that brings us to the end of Perfect Remedy. And I've got my guitar here. Maybe we should have a little like I say, sing-song of Dress Book just close it out.
That'd be funny, wouldn't it? Way to demonetize your YouTube account.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. So, overall, I mean, has your opinion changed at all in the last 60 minutes since we started? Is there anything else that's kind of come to mind about the overall album?
I think you've made some interesting points that I hadn't really considered before. I think I'm now more aware of the fact that the track listing was poorly chosen. It was never going to be a number one record, that album. Just because of the period Quo were in, and perhaps even the quality of the material itself probably wasn't quite good enough for a top 10 album. But the album could have done a lot better than it did. And it would be held in much higher esteem if I think some of the B-sides had made it on as album tracks. And I think if the right songs had been picked as singles, I think the conversation we'd be having would be quite different. I think it's a shame that it's kind of Quo's forgotten 80s album. I think it was just bad decision making.
Yeah, I think so. When you look at everything, but then looking back in hindsight, there's a lot of things I think you can change, isn't there, about these things when you look back. But yeah, that is Perfect Remedy. Your book, Status Quo in the 1980s, is still out there. Still available on sale. I'll leave the link for that in the comments below.
Possibly in bargain bins somewhere, or being used as a draft excluder in your next door neighbour's conservatory. But it is still out there, yeah.
Excellent. Have you got anything else that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I'm working on a book with Rhino at the moment. The John Rhino Edwards bass book, which it's currently called. It might not have that title later on. We're expecting that to sell dozens of copies. Or maybe a dozen copies, I'm not sure. It's definitely a passion project. And it's something that we're taking a lot of care over. The transcriptions are done. So there's transcriptions of a lot of his bass parts from his solo material in there. And if nothing else, it'll just give bass players something to play along to. It's quite an exciting time to be a Status Quo fan as a bass player.
Well, I'm not a bass player, but I look forward to reading it and seeing what it's all about. Thanks for being a guest on the Quo-Cast once again, Greg. Please do come back.
Thanks, Jamie. Ta-ra, mate.